Okay, we had to take a quick break just so that I could get the kids off to school and help around the house and whatnot. And so I'm still in my natural and unwashed state, hoping it's going to thaw out a little bit enough to go outside and possibly ride a skateboard around and then do some reading later. But for now, I want to make it through this Putnam lecture. We left off in a weird spot, so let's just jump right back into it. This is um, just about to talk about naive realism, I think. I don't know why the camera panned out. It's very strange, but all right. And the sound on this is a bit weird. It's got a buzzing, but whatever.
Although the earliest source, if I would like to see it, I always thought there was an earlier source, but the earliest source I've been able to find for the phrase naive realism is a book of Russell's published in 1940. The idea that the mass of mankind are quite mistaken in thinking that the colors, textures, and other secondary properties of the objects they claim to perceive, that the mass of mankind mistakenly think that the secondary properties of the objects they perceive are out there in the things themselves, when they are really just our own sense data, is an old idea. But calling that idea naive realism, I think is Russell's invention.
Yeah, so that is an old idea that you can trace at least back to Descartes. So he doesn't he says it's a confused idea of the external properties, to think of them as inhering in the objects. He doesn't say it's naive or, there's a kind of view, naive realism. So I didn't know that Russell coined that term.
For Russell, it was already quite clear when he wrote The Problems of Philosophy in 1912, and still clear in 1940, even after a flirtation with direct realism, in the analysis of mind, that we do not observe physical objects at all. He wrote, when in ordinary life we speak of the color of the table, this is the 1912 book, when in ordinary life we speak of the color of the table, we only mean the sort of color which it will seem to have to a normal spectator from an ordinary point of view under usual conditions of light. But the other colors which appear under other conditions have just as good a right to be considered real, and therefore to avoid favoritism, we are compelled to deny that in itself the table has any one particular color. And about 10 pages later, because the Problems of Philosophy moves very fast, about 10 pages later, and brilliantly, Russell has shown to his satisfaction that the table we see lies in our own private visual space. Not just that the table we see doesn't have any one real color, but the table we see lies in our own private visual space, and the table we feel lies in our own private touch space, etc. Quotes, my knowledge of the table as a physical object, on the contrary, is not direct knowledge. Such as it is obtained through acquaintance with the sense data that make up the appearance of the table. There is no state of mind in which we are directly aware of the table. All our knowledge of the table is really knowledge of truths, and the actual thing, which is the table, is not strictly speaking known to us at all.
This this way leads idealism, phenomenalism, and all those other things. So yes, old school sense data theory from Russell, very much.
Finally, our knowledge of the table must be via inference. Quotes, thus it becomes evident that the real table, if there is one, is not the same as what we immediately experience by sight or touch or hearing. The real table, if there is one, is not immediately known to us at all, but must be an inference from what is immediately known. Hence, two very difficult questions at once arise. One, is there a real table at all? And two, if there is, what sort of object can it be?
Right. This is like directly starting from Descartes and tracing your way through Hume into Berkeley, Russell. Russell arrives at a position that's very much in line with this British empiricist view. Sense data theory. Okay, cool, but we've outgrown this, so what's the punchline?
Nor is the Russell view wholly dated. Although philosophers who say that what we perceive are our own sense data are no longer thick on the ground, there are respected contemporary philosophers who deny that colors are real. Larry Hardin, for example. And if colors are not real, then much of what we take ourselves to see is not there to be seen.
Moreover, yeah, but when he says that colors are not real, he means they're not in the external world independent of our perception. So yes, okay.
Search of the internet under naive realism will reveal that quick refutations of naive realism, many of them 2 or 3 centuries old, are all over the place. For example, if naive realism is to be taken seriously and colors are out there in the world, then apples regularly change color depending on how much light is around them. It is much more plausible, though, to think that the apples are the same as they ever were, that all that has changed is our experience of them. That refutation assumes that the naive realist can't maintain that dispositions to have certain appearances to human beings cannot be out there in the world. In fact, even naive realists would include dispositions to have a certain look depending on the lighting conditions.
I mean, that's a weird view, though, because, like, so dispositions to affect humans were there before humans evolved. Dispositions to affect bees were there before bees evolved. That's a strange position. It's not impossible, but it's a bit weird.
And the position of the viewer as among the objective properties of the objects viewed. And today there are philosophers who are proud to call themselves realists, naive realists. Obviously, this new use represents a reaction against views like Russell's.
Yes.
And clearly the externalism, in this sense of externalism as naive realism, that I argued against above represents a sort of return to naive realism, as does my own call in the threefold chord for a second naivete in the philosophy of perception. But rather than try to survey all the contemporary views that represent more or less a defense of naive realism, what I shall do for a moment is look at Russell's position and see what points a defender of any degree of return to naive realism, at what points a defender of any degree of return to naive realism might reject it.
So I've said this before in my previous discussions of this. I thought this was going to be more about scientific realism. That's why I kind of got into this, but I guess Qualia. So I certainly agree that the phenomenology of perception seems like naive realism is true. I don't think does anyone deny that. You have to do some work to get to the point of view where you take Qualia seriously at all. The idea that that it even seems like there's a non-representational, non-intentional, non-functional, whatever, however you want to define it, mental quality associated with our experience takes work to arrive at. Whereas the world having these qualities, these not mental qualities, maybe they're mental, maybe they aren't, but that the world has these qualities is the common sense view. I still think that's right. But whether that's true or not, whether that's the best account of the seemingness of this is a different question, I would say. So I think there's 2 questions.
In the above quotations from the Problems of Philosophy, the following propositions are obviously assumed to be true. 1, we perceive our sense data.
Yes.
But the man and woman on the street mistakenly think that what they are perceiving are real physical things.
Right, exactly. And that's a theory.
We don't actually perceive physical objects. 3, what we know about physical objects we know by inference. The premises for those inferences come from observing our own sense data. Now I will read just a little of the next section, which is called Some Ways of Rejecting Russell's Picture. It's easy to find grounds for rejecting 1, 2, or all 3 of these Russellian propositions, but some ways of rejecting them hardly do justice to what William James called the natural realism of the ordinary person. Many of the ways of rejecting Russell's argument amount to little more than an appeal to ordinary language, ordinary usage. Not a bad thing when it's just one of a number of points made in a philosophical discussion, but hardly a satisfactory response by itself to a deeply thought out and complex metaphysical cum epistemological position such as Russell's. For example, one might say, we don't perceive visual sense data, we have them. And one might reject the second proposition by saying, when we have the appropriate visual sense data and we unconsciously and automatically infer that there's a table in front of us, then that's what we call seeing a table. That's what we call seeing a table. Obviously, this is not a rejection of Russell's metaphysical position at all, but simply a recommendation that Russellians find a way of expressing their view that's more charitable to ordinary ways of speaking. However, there are more substantive reasons that some philosophers would reject the idea that what we call seeing a physical object is actually inferring from our sense data. Although some of these grounds are, these more interesting grounds for rejecting that claim are also controversial. A widely held view today, for example, that the justification of observational beliefs, at least about such fundamental sensible properties as color, shape, texture, and hardness, is what's called a reliabilist one. It's just that it's enough to say that we've been programmed by evolution, so when any one of those beliefs is caused by impacts on our sense organs, an event that reliabilists identify with perceiving the objects when the causal chain is of the right sort, the belief is very is very likely to be correct.
Yeah, so I like this kind of reliabilism. It begs just the right questions. But you know, I've said in other videos around here, I think you want to distinguish these two questions. One, can the state itself be justified? And two, can I, the person with the state, be justified? So can I have justification? Can the state have justification? So I'm perfectly happy with reliabilism, externalism about the state. Not so happy with it about myself. So I don't think I would be justified. But I think the state would be justified by being reliably caused. Then you have to tell some other story about what it means to be justified from my point of view. It's going to involve these kind of states which are reliably caused. So it's not going to be completely divorced from that, but it's going to be a separate further kind of claim, maybe coherence or theory, story, something like that's going to come in there. But okay, very cool so far.
This reliabilist ground for rejecting Russell's position, unlike the ordinary language grounds, does involve a serious disagreement with Russell's metaphysics. Today's naturalistic reliabilists, rightly in my view, see perception as beginning with external things and transactions involving both those things and the organism, and not with sense data. That is, reliabilists are right, I think, in seeing perception as beginning with transactions with external things and not as beginning with transactions with sense data. But it would be theoretically possible to produce a version of reliabilism more friendly to at least a part of Russell's picture, but I won't try to sketch that now. And another common ground for rejecting Russell's picture is the so-called transparency of perceptual experiences. That is, the observation, which is really an observation about the phenomenology of perception, namely that when you try to focus on, say, the visual sense datum that you're having when you look at any particular object and focus on its color, it doesn't seem to you that you're focusing on the sense datum. It always seems to you that what you're focusing on is the physical object. G. Moore once wrote, "The moment we try to fix our attention upon consciousness and see what distinctly it is, it seems to vanish. It seems that as we had before us a mere emptiness. When we try to introspect the sensation of blue, all we can see is the blue. The other element is, as it were, diaphanous." But of course, any argument directly from...
Okay, so first of all, Moore does say that, but right after that, everyone conveniently forgets. He says, yeah, but if you can't pay attention to it. So I'm of the it's hard to do but can be done camp about paying attention to phenomenology, but that's not at odds with this idea that the common sense view is that the stuff is out there. Yeah, okay, maybe it is. Okay, but now let's not get distracted right now. All right, hold on.
Phenomenology to what the right metaphysics is itself problematic. Now, theories like Russell's are internalist theories in the sense that the inputs to perception, the sense data, like Hume's ideas and impressions, are entirely inside the subject's mind, according to these theories. And the mind is conceived of as either inside the brain, by materialists like Hans Reichenbach, my teacher, and Ruth Anna's teacher, or the inputs are conceived of as totally immaterial by Berkeley and arguably by Hume as well. Russell's view seems to have wavered between materialism and immaterialism over the years, depending on which of his books you look at. Such views represent what I called an interface conception in the threefold chord, because they allow us no truly cognitive access to the world, at any rate to the world outside the brain. But there's no good reason for present-day naturalist philosophy of mind to be internalist. In a way, this is something I already argued in The Meaning of Meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So, but before getting to that, I just want to point out, this is the kind of point that I was making against the idealists a while ago, that they often assume this kind of theory of perception, talk of the inner screen and the dashboard. It brings to mind this kind of picture, which is being analyzed here from Russell. But Russell is really just an exemplar of its long tradition, going back to, I would say, Descartes, at least in the West, that is. So once you have this picture of how perception works, it does seem hard to get out of the idealist arguments, or like the positing of the external world that's not mental being an extra step and all of that. So the question is whether that theory of perception should be taken for granted or seriously. I think Putnam's right. There could be versions of it that maybe are interesting, but it's not obvious that that's the right way to think about perception. So it's not obvious that we physicalist-friendly types are confused.
A central thesis of that essay was that we need an externalist and anti-individualist account of what it is to understand the words of a natural language. To think about gold or water or grass or most of the things we think and talk about is to engage in an activity that presupposes complex interactions with our environment and with other people. In The Meaning of Meaning, I expressed this by saying that meanings aren't in the head. But as a number of people later pointed out, I should have said the mind isn't in the head. It's not, I hasten to add, that the mind is somewhere else, say in the Lev. The mind isn't a thing with a location at all. So it is not simply the brain under another name, but a system of world-involving abilities and exercises of those abilities.
Interesting. So Putnam was an activist? External, yeah, I guess externalism, embedded in the environment and active. Okay, interesting. Huh.
This view is, I believe, now accepted by a majority of philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists. This is the view of the mind I've had for a long time. In the last few years, I have realized that it also captures what was right in functionalism. It's true that I originally gave the name functionalism to an internalist view. In my functionalist paper, The Nature of Mental States, back about 1975, the mind was identified with the brain, which was described as a computer, and our mental states were identified with computational states of that computer. That was wrong, but the idea that mental capacities and activities are ways of functioning was right, provided we allow that those ways of functioning may involve the environment and other people, and provided we do not limit the language used for the description of of those ways to the language of computer science. For that reason, in my Prometheus lecture, to which Carl referred, I refer to my present position as liberal functionalism, and to functional states as being liberal, in this liberal sense, as having long arms that reach out to the environment.
Yeah, that's what Bloch called long arm functionalism. Yeah.
In this terminology, the meaning of meaning is a liberal functionalist view of cognition, or an externalist view, if we don't give externalist the sense of naive realist. I said above that an externalist conception of thinking in this sense of externalist is now widely accepted in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. But once this becomes the case, as it obviously had not in Russell's view, nothing stands in the way of extending externalism to perceptual states as well. But now a problem arises, and this is the problem, the point at which I turn to McDowell's views in Mind and World.
Okay, so I have to admit that I am not a McDowell scholar. I do know that he has something to do with naive realism or this resurgence of the view. So that's interesting. And I know people that like McDowell a lot and hung out with them, and they talk about this stuff. So I have some peripheral familiarity with it. But okay, so grains of salt in place,
Which are where McDowell has a position diametrically opposed to Bloch's and to the whole idea of qualia that is of non-conceptual phenomenal characters common to both veridical and non-veridical experiences. To see
non-concept, say that again, that there's
opposed to Bloch's and to the whole idea of qualia that is of non-conceptual phenomenal characters common to both veridical and non-veridical experiences.
Non-conceptual, qualitative, or phenomenal characters associated with veridical and non-veridical experiences. So McDowell's going to deny that, because in the veridical case, there's the phenomenal character, which is the thing external to you, the object with its properties. But in the hallucination case, instead of having some phenomenal character, you have this other state that's indistinguishable from the first, but different somehow. Doesn't Bloch say somewhere that this is, I think I sort of remember him actually saying he disagrees with this way of characterizing the disagreement with him and McDowell. Because there can be these things which are conceptualized, but not in the right way. Or so I forget the exact reason he was on.
Conceptual phenomenal characters common to both veridical and non-veridical experiences. To see the problem to which I just alluded, let's recall that McDowell motivates his complex chain of arguments in Mind and World by laying down two requirements for a satisfactory philosophy of perception. The first, which he calls minimal empiricism, is that sensory impressions must be a tribunal before which our beliefs about the world can stand. And much of the controversy connected with that book has to do with McDowell's claim that this requirement can only be fulfilled if those impressions are themselves conceptualized. In other words, if you're not a total reliabilist about justification, if you think there's such a thing as having reason, good reason to believe that P, and that's not always the same thing as having arrived at P by a method with a high probability of yielding truths. And by the way, there's a powerful argument against reliabilism in Saul Kripke's, in one of the first long essays in Kripke's new collection of papers, which I just received a copy of. I mean, Kripke is devastating on examples of how something might be arrived by a method which in fact has high probability of yielding true beliefs and not be justified, and vice versa. No one is better at producing counterexamples than Saul Kripke.
Yeah, exactly. So philosophical troubles, these things are well known, but now it's coming back to me, this Bloch thing. So I think that, I think Bloch's overall position is that there can be a kind of justification which is iconic or, based on something that isn't conceptualized, so that you don't need a conceptual state to serve, or a conceptualized qualitative phenomenal character to stand as justification, because there can be a kind of justification, according to Bloch, which is iconic or like picture-like or something like that. So the real dispute is over whether there can be justification of that sort. Okay. Should we get the Philosophical Troubles book out?
Secondly, if you believe that, in other words, that there is such a thing as justification in a traditional epistemological sense as having good reason, then McDowell argues that minimal empiricism requires that we require that qualia themselves, if there are such things, sense impressions, which he does believe in, that sense impressions themselves must be able to constitute good reason for beliefs about the external world. The second, which is supposed to follow from the first, is that so reliabilism must be rejected. And then McDowell concludes, and this is really the gravamen of the whole of mind and world, is that in this demanding sense of justification, sense impressions can justify beliefs about the external world only if sense impressions, all sense impressions, are conceptualized.
That's what Bloch rejects, right? That there are phenomenal characters that are not conceptualized. Bloch thinks there are such things, at least not conceptualized as the thing that they, in a way that picks them out by their phenomenal character or something like that.
In addition to McDowell's views, Hilary Jacobson and I have argued, and she read this chapter of a book we're writing with this argument here in Jerusalem at a conference a couple of weeks ago. Hilary Jacobson and I have argued on both empirical and conceptual grounds that the phenomenal characters of perceptual experiences are not, or in any case, not always conceptualized in any of the senses McDowell has proposed. And if McDowell is right, it would follow they can't be a tribunal whether or not those phenomenal characters are identical with qualia. So McDowell were right, skepticism threatens us. Moreover, qualia, Bloch taught us, are brain states and hence internalistically identifiable. We might, of course, say that having appropriate qualia only counts as perceiving something when they're caused in the right way. But didn't I criticize that account a moment ago? So it looks as if we've handed game, set, and match to the skeptic and fallen back into Russell's picture, or a physicalist variant of Russell's picture. My present view is almost the complete opposite of McDowell's, and I have to skip now some things. Where McDowell requires that impressions must be a tribunal, I have argued that it's apperceptions and seeming apperceptions, reviving an old term as old as Kant, but one still around in psychology. It's
perception, judgment about what apperception is in Kant's term is like the thing which puts the unity of our perceptions all together, or something like that. Okay. These are going to be judgments, though, right? Okay.
Perceptions and seeming apperceptions that are the tribunal and not impressions. Some apperceptions and seeming apperceptions, for example, I say seeming apperceptions to cover the case like in the Miller-Lyer illusion, where you seem to apperceive that one bar is longer than the other. Now, in that case, you know that you're not actually apperceiving that in the success sense of apperceive. You know it's not, but an apperception is not really a belief. I know that the belief that I don't have the belief that one bar is longer than the other. I believe they're the same length. But I continue to seem to apperceive that one bar is longer than the other. The notion of apperception goes missing really as a byproduct of logical empiricism, or logical positivism. Ever since the logical positivists came on the scene, there's been a distinction between, on the one hand, sense impression, sense data, in the sense of the Erlebnisse that Carnap talked about in the Logische Aufbau. So there have been sense data, like for Neurath, there's Oscar's sense data at time t, red star in visual field. Appropriate for Neurath because he was a red. Now, and secondly, there have been sentences about sense data, protocol sentences. And then beliefs tend to be identified with sentences. So when Davidson, for example, concludes that he doesn't think that bare sense impressions can justify anything, the only possible alternative that he sees is to say that it's sentences that justify other sentences. And nothing can justify a sentence but a sentence. Or to make it more less linguistic, or logical positive sounding, that only beliefs can justify other beliefs. But apperceptions are not exactly beliefs, because they can, or seeming apperceptions are not beliefs, but neither are they bare sense data. They are conceptualized. And I would say it's the fact that we lost the idea of Kant, who has the distinction between sensations and apperceptions, argues incorrectly, I think, that we can ignore sensations which are not apperceptions because they're, quotes, nothing to us. I think that's actually a bad argument, but that's a long discussion. So, I mean, I don't, unlike McDowell, I don't agree that reliabilism must be completely rejected. Secondly, I think when it comes, reliabilism as a general account of justification is wrong. But when it comes to basic perceptual judgments, like the judgment that something is red, it may be that something close to reliabilism is the best that we can do.
The judgment.
Now, the version of reliabilism that McDowell considers in Mind and World is one in which impressions cause beliefs, because he has after all read Davidson, and through Davidson read Neurath. He's against the view in which impressions cause beliefs in a way that McDowell associates with bald naturalism, that is, a way which is just a matter of subpersonal mechanisms, and thus wholly outside of what he calls the space of reasons. I agree with McDowell that we want something at the level of interpersonal psychology, something more than an account of subpersonal mechanisms. Moreover, Russell's claim that we know about the table or the rabbit on the lawn by inference is simply unbelievable. If the inference is it's unbelievable if the inference is supposed to be conscious. And if it's supposed to be unconscious inference, as Helmholtz proposed, then what we have is, again, just a hypothesis about subpersonal mechanisms in the brain. And a hypothesis which is not particularly convincing for at least two reasons. Subpersonal mechanisms may perform syntactic operations that are at the personal level, that we at the personal level interpret as inferences, such as writing in mentalese both A and B given, writing A and given A and B, but writing one or two formulas given a third formula as input is not inference, it's only a syntactic representation of an inference. And two, we know now about forms of computation that don't consist of inferences in the sense of first-order logic at all. There are just many more possibilities for modeling the subpersonal processes involved in thought and perception than Helmholtz could have thought of. But we don't need to speculate about this. It's enough to see that a story about visual qualia causing beliefs, i.e. sentences, via unconscious mechanisms, however interesting to investigate, is not an account of perception at the level we seek. About that, McDowell is right. This is a relevant objection to one form that reliabilism can take. Apperception is a phenomenon at the psychological level, the level of rational agency. And there's no reason...
Yeah, so I just was checking over here in Bloch's response. He does say Putnam's apperception is perceptual judgment. A perceptual judgment, though. Got it. That is a weird way to put it. I mean, Bloch has all kinds of interesting views here, but there's something experiential. They do seem longer. I guess his is just that the seeming is this judgment seeming about a perceptual judgment. That's not a belief. It's separate from that. In the Mueller-Lyler case, where the lines seem unequal in some sense. It's a visual perceptual judgment and apperception. Okay, interesting.
Why there shouldn't be an account of the perceptual transactions of human beings and other organisms with their environments at that level. In the human case, such an account will involve also an account of language acquisition and of the role of our linguistic abilities in apperception. A liberal functionalist, in my sense, can agree with McDowell that conceptualization plays an important role in perception in a demanding sense of perception. McDowell's mistake is to assume all experience to perception in the demanding sense. Yeah, I'm going to skip, since it's getting late, I'm going to skip two sections. I'll be glad to send anyone a copy of the whole paper, or if you email me, my account, I use Gmail, and it's just hilary.putnam@gmail. And remember, Hilary is spelled with one L. Okay, I want to close with some observations on the form of skepticism that preoccupies McDowell, which has sometimes been called Kantian skepticism. It's not skepticism of the how do we know form, but rather skepticism of the form, how was it possible that our thoughts have content? Jim Cohn has called this Kantian skepticism. Although a long time ago, I myself was tempted by the desire for a reductive account when I wrote, "The brain's understanding of its own medium of computation and representation consists in its possession of a verification of semantics for the medium, that is, of a computable predicate which can represent accessibility or warranted assertability or credibility." McDowell's work has been consistently free of all signs of such a temptation. What bothers McDowell is something else. The obvious answer to the how is it possible question, if we prescind from the difficult question of reference to unobservables, is what's your problem? Don't we see objects in the environment all the time? Don't we touch and handle them all the time? What's the problem about how we can refer to them? But the fact that our perception of such familiar objects as apples and chairs depends on bits of sensory intake, that's McDowell's term, leads, if we identify that sensory intake with impressions, and we identify impressions in turn with unconceptualized qualia, straight to the conclusion that the basis for all our knowledge of the external world is our qualia. And it's hard to see how they can be a basis. Well, even if we don't hope for a reductive account of reference and content, it is reasonable to posit that what we can conceive and what we can refer to depends, at least in its initial stages, on what we have cognitive contact with. If all we have cognitive contact with in the initial stages of empirical knowledge is qualia, how do we get out of solipsism? This is a reasonable worry. Indeed, that's the worry that drove analytic philosophy from Carnac's Logische Aufbau to Quine. And McDowell's principal philosophical claim is a way to give this worry rest, is to reject the idea of unconceptualized qualia altogether. They are impressions, of course, he says, but they put us in direct contact. But they put us in direct contact with the world, and they are conceptualized. They tell us about that world. But this combination of naive realism, really naive realism, and conceptualism with respect to the phenomenal character of experience is, I think, untenable on both empirical and conceptual grounds. Hilary Jacobson reviewed the empirical evidence against the claim that all impressions are conceptualized, and I think philosophically it's also weak. McDowell is certainly right that appearing to bear...
I mean, I think, I've written a little bit on this conceptualism claim from the higher order point of view, because it does seem like higher order theory of consciousness committed something in this general area in a way, but in a way not. Not committed to the claim that every single color experience deploys a concept of that color, but it's that color experiences are conceptual, and you can use concepts to describe yourself as being in these non-conceptual states that are as these guys posit them. So, and in fact, Jake Berger has this really cool and interesting paper that just came out recently in Eric Kentis, I think, where he tries to argue that you look, all of this phenomenological stuff that these first order naive realists appeal to can be captured by the higher order representational contents in these posited higher order states. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I don't know, but the point is just that you can agree with the phenomenology claims here and not agree with the kind of inference from them to this, this is the way things are. So it certainly does appear to us as though we're in these states that resist being called conceptual, but that doesn't mean that that appearance isn't the result of conceptual states doing their work, which is, I guess there's different versions of conceptualism, or that in some way, as Jake and I put it in our joint paper in the Festschrift for David Rosenthal, that the higher order thought theory of consciousness tries to kind of in a way blur the distinction between conceptualism and non-conceptualism about consciousness. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, so.
Presences can appear and provide an answer to the question as to how concepts and experiences are connected, or in McDowell's term, how experiences can rationally constrain beliefs. But to get to that, from that observation to the conclusion that the content of experience is conceptual, McDowell needs to assimilate sensory impressions themselves to apperceptions, and that's where we disagree. In fact, there are apperceptions that have no accompanying qualia. Suppose I raise my right hand. I have an apperceptive awareness that I raised it, that that it didn't just go up, that this is a voluntary thing. But there's no quale of voluntariness. I think I remember that Elizabeth Anscombe somewhere describes this kind of awareness as knowledge without observation. But seems to me a misdescription. I would say I did observe that I raised my hand voluntarily, but this is an observation without any particular qualia. Or to use a term employed by Alvin Noe, an instance of amodal awareness. Similarly, my awareness when I...
Yeah, amodal awareness. But there's a feeling of voluntariness. He doesn't think it's there. Well, I talked to Mirto Milopoulos about this for Consciousness Live, and I think if you pay attention, if you really deconstruct this, there is a sense of agency, a sense of control, and agentive experience in a way of voluntariness that you don't really notice until you contrast it with cases where it's missing, like an alien limb phenomenon and these other sorts of things. But okay, that's a minor point. Okay.
A tomato, I'm seeing something which has a round other side and a soft interior. I see it that.
Oh yeah, so that's amodal completion. So you see there's a sense in which you feel like the whole thing is there, even though you don't see the whole thing. Yes, good.
Involves amodal awareness and not only qualia. McDowell thinks he has to say that impressions warrant beliefs, and that's the reason that he needs them to be conceptually articulated. My view is that it is apperceptions that warrant beliefs. Of course, certain sorts of apperceptions are internally related to impressions, but it is the apperceptions and not the impressions that do the warranting. Babies and languageless animals do not have apperceptive awareness in the demanding Kantian or Macdowellian sense, but I see no reason to deny them qualia. Of course, if there's little hope of a reductive account of apperception, as there is of a reductive account of intentionality, indeed apperception involves intentionality. Of course, there is as little hope of a reductive account of apperception as there is of a reductive account of intentionality, that is of reference. Indeed, apperception involves intentionality because it involves recognizing things and goings on for what they are, and recognizing involves applying concepts. Apperceiving something or event in my environment is what I called a functional state with long arms a few minutes ago, a world-involving functional state in a very liberal sense of functional state. As a liberal functional sees things, under normal conditions, neither our perceptual experience nor sentences are the beginning of the process of forming a perceptual belief. The beginning is outside our heads. The process of forming a perceptual belief to the effect that there's a bottle of water on this table is an exercise of a function, in fact a whole system of functions, some shaped by evolution and some by cultural processes, that connect me to objects and going-ons in my environment, in this case to the rostrum and to the bottle of water. Forming beliefs in accordance with our normal biological functions and our linguistic upbringing is not just uttering noises that are mere responses to qualia, although those qualia are a part of the causal chain that connects the normal formation of a particular perceptual belief on the basis of seeing something in one's visual field. On a liberal functionalist story, for either our beliefs or the proto-beliefs of animals and pre-linguistic children to have content is just for them to function as representations of external states of affairs. If we think of psychological states, including, importantly, apperceptions, as including objects, inputs, or otherwise non-propositional, and in important cases not themselves mental items, then we will have to come up with a new account of representation, and of transitions from inputs to representations, which is obviously a demanding project, one which perhaps will take centuries to get very far with. But we will not insist that the non-propositional and non-mental items must be conceptualized. As Steve Wagner has put in my view, once we understand rational functions ecologically, we can put the state transitions inside them without facing a paradox about what objects could be doing in perception. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I want to thank Professor Putnam not only for giving us an amazing talk about perceptual experience, but in fact giving us a philosophical experience. Professor Putnam will take questions outside afterwards. In order to stay on schedule, we'll take a break now. I just want to say one last thing. We've seen here not only a tour de force, but a tour of philosophy full not only of wisdom, but of knowledge and of experience. And I'm reminded of a story about...
He said enough of the compliments, so let's respect his wishes. Wow, it was 3 videos ago, though. Okay, wow, very interesting. Huh. Thought this was going to help me with my quest to understand Hassock chain and pragmatism, but this didn't help. There's a lot I agree with Putnam. I've been very influenced by Putnam and Bloch, obviously, so. But I want to think more about our perception and perceptual judgments and phenomenology of them generally. I should reread that Bloch thing too. Okay, and